Hello and welcome to the 2024 In Review podcast on Tales from the Backlog. I'm Dave, as always, and in this episode we're going to go through my top 10 games from 2024. We're going to take stock in maybe some trends in the list that may be a little bit different from years past, and we're going to reflect a little bit on the year in podcasting, as it was a pretty big year for me, honestly. By my standards, but yeah, big year. So here we are. At the top of the show, I'll note that this is only covering the games that came out in 2024. If you're interested in my favorite games that I played from other years for the first time in 2024, you can hear that episode on Patreon. It will be available for all paid patrons, and that will be a very similar episode, except we're going to have a lot more games to cover in that one. In 2024, I played 14 of the new releases out of 63 games completed at the time of recording. So 2024 made up a sizable chunk of the games that I played, but as always, most of the games that I played were from the past years. And I like that balance. I like to be able to play some new stuff, but I do tend to really enjoy catching up on stuff that I'd missed before. So before getting into the list proper, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's helped the podcast grow over the past year. There has been growth in basically every way that you can measure growth in the podcast in 2024. More people are downloading. The baseline metric for what I consider to be a well-performing episode has risen compared to this time last year. And one of the coolest things that happened this year is I continued to be able to work with more and more awesome people around the gaming industry, and honestly, some people that I would consider to be out of my league in a lot of ways. And so I'm eternally grateful to everybody who agrees to come on the podcast and discuss these games with me. And I'm also grateful for some people that helped me make this happen. I'm not an industry worker. I'm just a guy who makes a podcast. I'm a guy who plays games and likes talking about them. And to be able to work with actual, awesome people within the industry, new community members, and everybody in between, returning guests, of course, it's been fantastic. So I want to give a quick shout out to two people that I think really made a difference in raising the podcast's profile a little bit this year, and my own. I still have a very limited reach, of course, but there was some ways that the profile got raised this year. So I want to give a quick shout out to Matt, aka Stormageddon, for being a great friend, first and foremost, but also being just a wonderful connector and supporter to not only me, but so many of us in the indie podcast sphere. Matt knows everybody, and Matt will not shy away from connecting if they think that that's the right thing to do for everybody involved. So thank you to Matt, and thank you to Jacob McCourt for basically making it possible for me to go to PAX East this year, 2024, and be on that panel with some wonderful people. By the way, in a couple of months, I will have the final person from that Nintendo DS panel. Everybody else has been a guest on the podcast. We'll check off the last person here in a couple months, so be on the lookout for that. But I would not have been able to make that trip if Jacob had not allowed me to be a part of that panel. So thank you, Jacob, for that small decision. It might be a small decision on your part, but it really made a lot of things possible for me, so I thank you. And I want to thank everybody who has supported the show on Patreon this month. New patrons, old patrons alike, even the free patrons who sign up for free just to listen to episodes a little bit early. That means a lot to me that you want to, put your login information in to hear a podcast early. And everybody who chooses to support financially, thank you so much. That means the world to me, and it's going to make, hopefully, a trip to PAX East 2025 happen. And I don't think I could be able to do that without you all. So thank you. And one more shout out. This is for everybody who just listens to the podcast. Whether you listened one time, maybe this is your first time. Thank you for clicking on a new podcast. Everybody who keeps coming back, everybody who joined the Discord server and continues to make that a wonderful place to hang out online. Thank you all very much. Now, let's get on to the list of the top 10 games from 2024. So, this list is my top 10 in order. They are ranked 1 through 10 games that I played in 2024. And before I get to the list, before I get to the notable omissions from the list and all of those things, I want to plant a little seed. And this is something that I've been thinking about, but it really started to take shape once I started to actually put things in order on the list. So, the big trend is that this year, in particular, my lists every year, they're always a mix of AAA and indie, but this year in particular, with one notable exception, the most meaningful gaming experiences that I had were all indie games. Aside from, like I said, there's one very notable exception to that. And that's not to say that there are no AAA games on this list. There are several. But when I think about the impact that games have had on me this year, when I think about the most memorable experiences, when I think of, frankly, the most positive experiences, a lot of that is coming from indie. So I really buck against the idea that AAA has nothing to offer in the industry, that AAA is boring, that AAA has no new ideas. That's all bullshit. AAA has a lot to offer to people who like video games. That being said, I do see, the ranking is the ranking. And when I think about impact that games have had, whether it be through narrative or cool new mechanical ideas, art or music, a lot of that is coming from indies. And this isn't news, but it is something that I noticed when I started to actually rank things. So we'll see if that continues in 2025. Spoiler alert, I think it will. So, for games from 2024, first of all, here are games that I did not play from 2024, so they will not be making an appearance on here. Some really heavy hitters. I didn't play Dragon Age, did not play Astrobot, Arco, Tales of Kenzera, Echoes of Wisdom, the new Zelda game, Star Wars Outlaws, Tactical Breach Wizards, Rise of the Golden Idol, Dungeons of Hinterberg, Conscript, Hollow Body, Neva, Indica, Unicorn Overlord, and so many more. So if you love those games, and I know a lot of people do love those games, we have a bunch of community lists, their top 3s in this episode. I did not play those. They will not be on my list, but a lot of those things on the list I am genuinely looking forward to playing at some point. But don't take my word for it. Here are some people from the community sharing their lists. And what I've done is when we have something in common, notable on the lists, I will save it for that section in the podcast. But these people had lists of games that I did not play. So we'll get them shouted out at the beginning of the episode here. No shade. I just, obviously lots of great games on these lists. I just didn't play them. So here's where we categorize them. Here is a list from Dave C., who's one of our patrons. Thank you, Dave. Number 3, Dragon Age the Veilguard. Number 2, Arco. And number 1, Unicorn Overlord. Good list. Next up is Randall, a patron. Thank you, Randall. Number 3 is Summer House. Number 2, Hunt Showdown 1896. And number 1, Path of Exile 2. Again, some cool games. I'm very interested in Path of Exile 2. Next up is Matt, aka Stormageddon. Thank you, Matt. Matt's a patron from the Fun and Games and Reignite podcasts. Their top 3 are number 3, Arranger, a role-puzzling adventure. Number 2, Dragon's Dogma 2. And number 1, Dragon Age the Veilguard. No surprise there. And we have Adam from Enter the Survival Horror Halftone Takes podcast, many-time guest on this podcast. Adam's number 3 is Crow Country. Number 2, Silent Hill 2 Remake. And number 1, Hades 2. Early access, making the top 3. Hell yeah. I can't wait to play Hades 2 once it's out of early access. Next up is John H. with no H, one of the hosts of the Video Game Lounge podcast. John's number 3 is Tales of Kenzera Zao. Number 2, Tekken 8. Number 1, Helldivers 2. I should play Helldivers. Did I miss the boat on Helldivers? Is it still a thing that people are playing? I feel like I missed that one. Looks like a lot of fun. Next up is Darth Egg. Number 3 is Rise of the Ronin. Number 2, Persona 3 Reload. And number 1, Helldivers 2. And hey, along those lines, finally, we have Will from the Friday Night Gamecast, guest on this podcast. Number 3, Helldivers 2. Number 2, Dragon's Dogma 2. And number 1, Astrobot. So thank you all for submitting your lists. We have more community top 3s on the way. And now it's time to talk about my list. Starting with some games that I played but did not make the top 10 for various reasons. First on that list is Sheepy, a short adventure, which is a free platformer you can get on Steam. It's free. It's actually very, very good. It's really good. It just didn't make the top 10. It's very short, but like no shade against like the quality of the game itself. It's actually very, very good. And it's free. So go check out Sheepy, a short adventure. Next up is Pacific Drive, which I did play about maybe half of the game, maybe 15 to 20 hours of. I thought it was pretty cool. I just got distracted, never played it again, but it was a pretty cool game and recommended for those who want like a type of maybe like a Subnautica on land, but instead of monsters in the ocean, you have like crazy weather. I described it as like, what if the weather was a cryptid? That's Pacific Drive. Check that out. It's a cool game. I just didn't finish it. Next up that I played but is not on the list is The Plucky Squire, which there will be a podcast coming out in February starring special guest Roger Reichart of the Gamerheads podcast. We'll be talking all about The Plucky Squire. The fact that it's not in the top 10 doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy it. I actually did like The Plucky Squire, just didn't make the top 10. And then the final game that did not make the cut that I played was Dragon's Dogma 2, which is the most disappointing 2024 release that I played this year. I think there are a lot of things to like about Dragon's Dogma 2, but I think people really exaggerate the things that they praise it for. The emergent things out in the world are kind of cool. I think that people really exaggerate how little the game holds your hand. The game actually holds your hand quite a bunch. It's just not in the ways that most games do. I mean, the pawns will tell you literally everything. You have to go out of your way to not get pawns that will tell you everything to do. So, and the story is so boring. It was the most bored I've been with maybe any story in a video game this year. So I didn't finish Dragon's Dogma 2. It's the only one on this that I have like, yeah, I was disappointed. We'll just leave it at that. So, not on the list. Starting with the list, let's start with my number 10 game from 2024, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was developed and published by Square Enix, and it is episode 141 of Tales from the Backlog with guests Aaron Engel and Ryan Arrington. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth kind of shares some stuff with last year's Final Fantasy entry on the list, which was Final Fantasy XVI, which is a game that is extremely uneven, although I will say I liked this game more than Final Fantasy XVI. I think that the Final Fantasy series has blown itself up into a state where they frustrate me just as often as they wow me. They do wow me a lot, but I think that this game was just too much. Now, what I will say is that for the Final Fantasy VII diehards, like my guests on the podcast episode, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth might be your favorite thing that you played this year because it is a wildly expanded version of that original game. You can just spend so much time in it. If that's what you really want, that's what you get here. For me personally, I was just as frustrated by some of the design decisions in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth as I was impressed. The things that wowed me about Final Fantasy VII Remake, the previous one, like the combat system, the music, the voice performance, bringing characters to life. I mean, the rehabilitation of Yuffie has been insane. That stuff alone puts Final Fantasy VII Rebirth in the top 10, because at the end of the day, this is an action RPG, and this has one of the best action RPG combat systems ever made, in my opinion, satisfying both parts of that equation, like equal emphasis on that action part, dodging, blocking, managing space and positioning, and the RPG elements like magic spells, buffs, debuffs, elemental attacks and weaknesses, and all that stuff. All that stuff is awesome. There's a lot of stuff to talk about the story. I'm not going to get into the story of that. Go listen to that podcast if you want the story discussion. But for the simple thing of playing an action RPG and getting into the mechanics in the way that Rebirth asks you to, I loved it so much. It's so good. So my hat truly goes off to the people who worked on that combat system, the voice actors, the people who worked on bringing these characters and locations to life. All of that stuff is great. It's just, you know, it's at number 10 because of those other things. And I don't want to dwell on that too much. Again, there's an almost 3-hour long podcast about that if you want to hear it. So that is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and we have some community submissions that agree with me. So here are those distinguished folks. We have Jake, a patron from the Pre-Order Bonus podcast. Jake's number 3 from 2024 is 1000 Times Resist, number 2 is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and number 1 is Arco. Next up is Nomad from the Retro Wildlands podcast, number 3 Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, number 2 Helldivers 2, and number 1, a game I've never heard of called Iron Meat, which Nomad says is a Contra-like. Next up is Adam Big Fudge Desba. Number 3 is Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. Number 2, Dragon's Dogma 2. And number 1, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Next up is Lucas from the Game Over Hell YouTube channel. Number 3, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Number 2, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door HD. And number 1, Persona 3 Reload. Next up on the list at number 9 is Mouthwashing. Mouthwashing, developed by Wrong Organ and Critical Reflex, will be the subject of a future episode coming in the spring, so be on the lookout for that. Mouthwashing is the last game that I completed this year from 2024. As I'm recording this, I just beat it maybe last week, and it was worthy to bust onto the list and bump a few games down. Mouthwashing is a short first-person walking simulator gameplay light horror game, but what's cool about Mouthwashing, especially as a horror game, is it doesn't scare you in the same way that, like, you know, when I say walking sim gameplay light first person horror game, you might think of something like Amnesia or something like that. Mouthwashing doesn't scare you in that same way of, like, you know, spooks and things jumping out at you and stuff like that. Mouthwashing scared me more after I was done with the game and started processing what happened, and specifically processing who these people are deep down, what went into the decisions that they made, and how they rationalize those decisions to themselves. It is a very pessimistic game in a lot of ways. It's kind of interesting. Shout out to Control Alt Noob for giving me this elevator pitch for Mouthwashing that I might actually use in the podcast. But it's like, if anyone's played the game Tacoma, Mouthwashing is like the opposite of Tacoma in so many ways. So very interesting to think about, and it kind of like chills you the more you sit and think about what happened in the story here. And I won't say more than that, but it's really good at that. Also of note in Mouthwashing is, frankly, disgusting sound design, and that's a compliment. It's gross and it's very effective, and the cinematography, you see the old PlayStation 1 visual style of Mouthwashing, very low fidelity, but that doesn't mean that great care wasn't taken in the visual presentation of Mouthwashing. The art direction is really stellar, shifting like between the corridors of the ship to really surreal stuff with crazy visual effects for story emphasis and just an overall fantastic presentation. So that is number 9 on my list, Mouthwashing. Next up to number 8 on my list, it is the one and only Balatro. Balatro was developed by Local Thunk, published by PlayStack, and it was episode 111 of Tales from the Backlog with special guests Matt, aka Stormageddon, and Aaron Clausen, Aaron's from the Superpod Saga podcast. And at this point, I'm recording this a few days after the Game Awards. Balatro cleaned up a bunch of awards, including basically anything to do with indie games, which I think some other games could have gotten some shine, but as the winner, I'm not like mad that Balatro won those awards. Balatro is a great game, and I'm not sure what is left to be said about Balatro, but that has never stopped me before. If it did, this podcast wouldn't have started in the first place. So here we go. Balatro takes really familiar rhythms of deck building roguelikes. You know, at this point, so many of us have played one of these, whether it was, you know, Slay the Spire or Monster Train or Wild Frost or Inscription or any of the other, you know, big name deck building roguelikes. It takes those familiar rhythms, but it builds the game instead of around, you know, new vocabulary, new settings, new proper nouns. It builds it around something that we already know, you know. The 52 card deck of playing cards is, you know, it's culture. Everybody fucking knows what a deck of cards is across cultures. So you don't have to explain when starting up Balatro that a king is higher than a queen and a queen is higher than a jack and stuff like that. And it also takes, of course, poker terminology and some concepts. Not the most difficult concepts from poker, but easier ones, like what is a flush? What is a straight? What does it mean to have two pair? Stuff like that. Stuff that even someone like me who doesn't care about poker, I know how to play, thank you Red Dead Redemption 2, but I don't play. So if the game literally was poker roguelike, as the elevator pitch says, I probably wouldn't have played it. But it's not. It's a deck builder, and it builds the deck building concepts. Again, instead of making you learn proper nouns and new status effects and stacks and stuff like that, it's like, hey, do you know anything about poker and can you do mental math? That's what Balatro really is. And I think that's what helps Balatro set itself apart against all of these other deck building roguelikes that are vying for your attention. There's not a bunch of new vocabulary to learn. There's no codex to learn, well, there is a codex, but it's like, you know, double check what is a straight flush, stuff like that. It's not like you need to learn the names of factions or new status effects or something like that. You basically already know how to play, which I think helps this game break through to a wider audience. Once those basic concepts are introduced, Balatro has a really unique way of building the game up through the Joker synergies and through the little micro decisions that you make. Do I skip this blind? What do I buy in the shop? How are my Jokers going to synergize? And so many more decisions that you make along the way. It's really simple, but it's really perfect. It is a perfect video game. It's only number 8 on the list, but this is a home run. You don't need me to tell you that Balatro is a home run. What's interesting too about Balatro is a lot of times when I beat deck building roguelikes or roguelikes in general, when I complete a run, I'm done. You know, I beat Slay the Spire once with every character and never touched that game again. I beat Monster Train like 2 times, haven't touched that game since. Balatro's turned into like my favorite mobile game after I originally played it on PC. it has turned into the best way for me to kill 20 minutes when I'm waiting for something that's cooking in the oven, or if I'm in a line somewhere, or I'm waiting for between appointments at work or something. Balatro is there for me, and I think it's going to stay on my phone and have longer legs than a lot of the other deck building roguelikes. So shout out to you, Balatro. I know you were waiting for my shout out. And shout out to one person from the community who put Balatro at number 1 on their list. It is Dan from Canada. Thank you, Dan. Dan's top 3 games from 2024 are Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Animal Well, and Balatro. Next up on the list is number 7. And we go from a solo developed game to a massive AAA game here. Number 7 on my list for 2024 is Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth. Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth, developed by Ryuga Gotoku Studios and published by Sega, is episode 128 of Tales from the Backlog with special guest Deadbeat Punk, the nicest man on the internet, from the What the Fuck Do You Want podcast. Go check that episode out. We had a great time talking about the story, and to the surprise of nobody at all, the yearly Yakuza release makes my Game of the Year list. Now, that's not to say that any Yakuza release will automatically make the list. I think of Like a Dragon Ishin may have been an honorable mention from 2023. But Infinite Wealth is good enough to be on the list on its own merits, plus it's a Yakuza game and I love the series to death. Infinite Wealth actually is a big improvement on a lot of the systems from Yakuza Like a Dragon. A couple years later, still have to think about how do I say the titles of these games. But it was a good improvement over Yakuza Like a Dragon, specifically with the combat system. The ways that things can interact within the combat system is just a step up. One of the big things that the developers have done in the last couple games is find a way to translate the brawler beat-em-up combat from the original run of the Yakuza series and translate what we loved about that. Sticking guys' faces in microwaves, picking up motorcycles and bashing guys over the head with them, throwing guys through plate glass windows, all that stuff. Translating that into turn-based combat. And instead of giving you a skill, head in microwave skill or something like that, it's all contextual interactions based on positioning around the environment. So those have been increased. The job system has been improved. The character roster is as good as ever, and the sheer number of side activities in Infinite Wealth is staggering. It has the same number of side activities as a standard Yakuza game, but also it has an entire Animal Crossing and Pokemon style game inside of it. There's a couple of new ones like the Crazy Taxi-esque delivery minigame, the Pokemon Snap-esque Sicko Snap. There's a whole lot of ways for you to continue to spend as much time with Ichiban and Kiryu and the rest of the party as possible, which is always time well spent. They are the best. I also really love the change in setting to Hawaii, specifically how going to Hawaii sets up great fish out of water situations for Ichiban, who you cannot praise Ichiban enough as a protagonist, as a player character. He is the best. Shout out to the Character Issues podcast, the best. Infinite Wealth also does the Yakuza series' greatest strength. Well, I don't want to say greatest strength. They have a lot of greatest strengths. But one of the most unique things about the series is the way that they can yo-yo between, walk the line between, and step over the line and jump back and forth between very serious and often heart-wrenching melodrama. And this game is no exception. This game has some very touching scenes in it and a bunch of serious melodrama. But also, this game has the goofiest shit you've ever done in a video game within the side quests most often. I mean, the baby Club guys. They're back, taking a vacation to Hawaii. They're here too. So in some ways, it is a Yakuza game, which is a Yakuza game, which is a Yakuza game. If you love the series, if you love what the series has traditionally done, then you're probably going to love this. But I didn't want to miss out on like some of the very awesome qualities that Infinite Wealth brings to the series as well. I don't think that this studio has missed yet. I don't think there's a bad Yakuza game, and Infinite Wealth is certainly one of the best ones. So, worthy of being on the list. And hey, don't take my word for it. Here are some people that agree with me. First up is Thrak from the 3DO Experience podcast. Thank you, Thrak. Thrak's number 2 is Hellblade 2. Number 2 is Penny's Big Breakaway. And number 1 is Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth. And we have Silcanet, who is a new patron. Thank you, Silcanet. Number 3 is Prince of Persia, The Lost Crown. Number 2 is 1000 Times Resist. And number 1 is Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth. Now we're on to number 6 on the list. Metaphor, Refantasio. Metaphor Refantasio is developed by Studio Zero and published by Atlus. Studio Zero is, of course, the internal studio in Atlus responsible for Persona games in the past. There will be an episode coming in February with Scott White, who is a writer and podcaster of the RPG University podcast. Look forward to that. Metaphor Refantasio, to me, is first and foremost, a masterclass in refinement of the type of game that a particular studio is known for making, much like another game later in this list. Atlus, and again more specifically Studio Zero, have taken what they learned making these calendar-based, life sim, dungeon crawling, turn-based combat, mashup games throughout the Persona series, and I think, having played a bit of Persona 4 now, played all of Persona 5 and now Metaphor, this just really feels like they mastered that formula and now they're adding new complicating factors into it. They know how to do this calendar system, the life sim system, the dungeon crawling, all of that stuff. And now they added cool stuff like, what if you had side quests and took road trips and had to plan around the weather and had to plan your party makeup based on what type of monsters are in this dungeon? What if the combat system built around exploiting weaknesses to gain extra turns got a little bit different and a little bit more interesting, in my opinion? What if we weren't so harsh on the time to hang out with the people in your party and really allowed you to explore what you wanted to explore? Take that 8-day road trip to clean up side quests if you want to do that. All of these things combine to make this my favorite gameplay experience of the ones that I've played from this studio. And on top of this, they left the familiar Japanese high school setting from the Persona series, made a brand new fantasy world, but it doesn't quite stop there at brand new fantasy world. It's at the same time a new fantasy world with new, tribes and races and things like that, but it's a fantasy world that is a commentary on fantasy in the first place. They really wanted to explore how can fantasy itself impact the real world? What if fantasy was connected to the real world? What is fantasy's role in society? And of course, a hefty dose of Carl Jung. In this game in particular, a big focus on Thomas More and the book Utopia, the art of Hieronymus Bosch, and more. There's a lot going into this game. There's a lot of really interesting stuff. Now, being an 80-plus hour game, I did think the story was a bit uneven. I did think that it didn't go as deep on some of these topics that I would have liked to in the game, but the good news is I, with my guests on the podcast, can go deep on those subjects, even if I felt like the game kind of mentions some of them. Not all, but some. Overall, this is a stellar video game. One that I had my ups and downs with throughout the process, but once you see everything that the game is doing and what the game is actually trying to say about some of these things, I think it is really interesting and cool. Well worth being in the top 10. So that's number 6, Metaphor Refantasio, and I want to shout out a community member who has this on their list. Shout out to Doug from the Core Gaming Retro Video Games Store. Look them up. Number 3 on Doug's list was Astrobot. Number 2 was Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And number 1, Metaphor Refantasio. Now it's time for number 5 on the list. We are in the top 5. And number 5 is Animal Well. Animal Well, developed by Billy Basso and published by Big Mode, is episode 131 of Tales from the Backlog with special guest Jenny Wyndham from Geeks and Grounds podcast, among many other things that Jenny does around the industry. And that was a really fun podcast to do. I mean, they're all fun, but there is really nothing quite like a game that is full of exploration and secrets and following your curiosity and then getting together with a friend to just say, hey, let's talk about all the cool shit we found. Did you find this? Did you find that? Wow, you found that. I don't even know what that is. Those types of discussions, I mean, that's like pure video game discussion right there. That goes back to the schoolyard. And Animal Well is one of those schoolyard discovery type video games. I mean, our Discord server was on fire when Animal Well was new, with people popping in, asking questions, sharing things they made, and all of that. And that's pure video game joy right there. One of my favorite things to do in a video game is to get curious about something, explore it, and be rewarded for my curiosity. Give me a treat. And Animal Well is just full of those things. And honestly, like, I demoed this at PAX East, and it was like a 10-minute demo. And as soon as I sat down and started playing and found the first hidden wall, I knew this was going to be a really fun game to explore. I knew it was going to be something special. And when that timer started ticking down, 10, 9, 8 seconds to go, I legitimately was like, I can't stop. I have to keep playing this. That's when I knew it was going to be special. So shout out to the way this game is designed. Shout out to the way it's presented also, this LED-inspired pixel art, this cavernous sound design, dripping water, echoes, animal sounds, things like that. The pixelated lighting and smoke effects that give you this like retro feel, but you know, this modern technology within that, all of that stuff is fantastic. It really led to a game that I could not put down as I was playing it. And one of the best parts about it, and I won't spoil too much here, but one of the best parts about it is it will engage your curiosity about the things that you see and even how to use the items that you pick up. It will let you experiment, and it will let you pull on the loose ends that open up. What's up with that animal that goes back into its burrow when I get close to it? How do I get up to that treasure chest up there? What's the deal with this mural with the picture of a rabbit on it? What elevated Animal Well into the top 5 and kept Animal Well in the top 5 despite the recency bias of some, games that came out later in the year is how the game reveals itself more and more to you as you pull on those threads. As you explore one thing, you'll open up more things, and you'll open up deeper layers in the secrets. It is a layered game in more ways than one. And because of that, Animal Well stays in the top 5. It's a wonderful game. If you haven't played it yet, give it a try. See where your curiosity takes you. I really think that this is an outstanding game and really rewarded my curiosity in a way that arguably no game did better in 2024. And don't take my word for it. Here are some community top 3s. First up is Marcus O'Neill, a patron from the Tiny Game Chronicles. Thank you, Marcus. Number 3 is Astrobot. Number 2, Unicorn Overlord. And number 1, Animal Well. Next up is Soccer, who's a patron. Thank you, Soccer. Number 3, Botany Manor. Number 2, Animal Well. And number 1, Ultros. I am excited to play Ultros sometime. And we have Roost Launcher, who is a patron. Thank you, Roost Launcher. Number 3 is 1000 Times Resist. Number 2 is Balatro. And number 1 is Animal Well. Next up, at number 4 in the top 5, UFO 50. UFO 50, developed and published by Mossmouth, is going to be on the podcast in the future once I figure out how the hell I'm supposed to cover this game. UFO 50 is a collection of 50 games from this fictional company called UFO Soft, making games for this fictional run of consoles in the 1980s. So there's 50 games inside of UFO 50. I have played maybe like 16 of them, 18 of them, something like that. So it's not a complete experience playing this. It's frankly maybe the reason why it's only at number 4. Only at number 4. This is just an insane product. When I say 50 games, I don't mean WarioWare micro games. I don't mean Mario Party mini games. I mean 50 whole ass games, ranging from every type of genre imaginable from the 1980s, and maybe some stuff that like is a retroification of maybe a more modern type of game. But you've got your platformers, you've got puzzle games, you've got strategy, you've got RPGs. When I say RPGs, remember, they're not mini games. These are long RPGs. One of them's like 60 hours long, inside of a package of 50 games that retails for like 25 bucks. Some of the games are arcade games. You know, back in the day, they would try their best to port arcade games onto the home consoles. And a lot of these games are very arcadey, games that don't seem to have endings, games that are high score based and stuff like that. Some of the other games are fairly short. They have distinct levels, they have endings, stuff like everything in between. There are not proper adjectives to describe this project. It's so fucking cool. What's even cooler about it is UFO 50 is not just a tribute to the games of the past. It is not 80s nostalgia only. What's cool about UFO 50 is the creativity that goes into these games. It's not like they just said, oh, okay, so like platformers were really popular. We're just going to make some platformers that are going to kind of feel like old platformers from the past. Like, legally distinct Mario from the NES or something like that. They didn't do that. They made creative platformers that might reference a game from the past or maybe smash the concepts of 2 or 3 games from the past into their own, like, really unique products here. So it is a love letter to gaming from this era of video games, but it's also a love letter to game design in general. The mashups of the genres, the unique mechanics. Some of these games are like refined versions of earlier games that the creators made, like the real creators in real life. It is really just like bewildering how much care went into this, into all of the games. Like, of the 18 that I've played, I don't love all of them, but I respect like the process behind making all of them, and I actually do love a lot of them. I love thinking about the design inspirations behind some of these games, which is, this is the passion behind this crazy project here. And like, I'm not even talking about the fictional meta history of UFO Soft, the fictional company in the game, or the other meta elements within UFO 50. UFO 50 is a feast of a collection. and it's one I'm not going to rush myself to finish. I will be dining on UFO 50 for a long time. And don't take my word for it, here are some other people who agree with me. First up is Kate from the No Small Games podcast. Kate's number 3 is Symphonia, number 2 is Mouthwashing, and number 1 is UFO 50. And we have Pie Boy. Number 3, The Talos Principle 2, Road to Elysium DLC. Number 2 is a Highland song, which was from late 2023, too late to get onto those lists. And number 1, UFO 50. So that is number 4, UFO 50, and now on to number 3 on the list. Number 3 on the list is Nine Souls. Nine Souls, developed and published by Red Candle Games, is going to be the focus of a future episode coming later in January. So if you want to hear the breakdown for Nine Souls, stay tuned, subscribe to the podcast. It will be coming in a few weeks with special guest community member Josh, or as you may know them, Dog Nozzle. So after playing earlier this year, in 2024, I played Detention and Devotion. Both games from Red Candle Games, Detention 2017, Devotion 2019. I played them both this year for the first time. And by the way, you might want to check out that Patreon episode about the best non-2024 games I played this year. Eyeball emoji, eyeball emoji. You might hear something about Red Candle's previous work in there. But after playing those and after recording about Devotion with Jill Grote, I got more excited about playing Red Candle's new game, Nine Souls, the Sekiro meets Metroidvania mashup. It looked really interesting. The Sekiro influence gave me a bit of pause, though, because I wasn't sure that I wanted a game that's that hard. Sekiro is one of the most difficult games that I've ever beat, and I really like that game, but I'm not always in the mood for that, But I dove in. The first 5 hours or so of Nine Souls were a real shock, and if you were watching me stream those, I hope you had fun watching me get legitimately mad playing the first 5 hours or so. The game felt brutally unfair. It felt unforgiving, to the point where it felt like the scales were always, in every situation, in every decision, tipped on the side of being more difficult. So much so that scale felt like it was about to topple over entirely. But I kept playing, and one of the things that kept me playing Nine Souls, to the point where I did eventually get to grips with the combat system and come to love it, even during the most difficult boss fights that I did in any game this year, the final boss of Nine Souls is a real piece of work. I had a lot of fun though. But what helps me get to that point is that Nine Souls is not just a combat game. Nine Souls has, and not a shocker if you played Red Candle's earlier games, it has an awesome story, a heartfelt, theme-rich story. So if you play Metroidvanias because of the gameplay design, and it's one of my favorite types of, game structures, the Metroidvania structure. If you play them for that, a lot of times I think that like a nice story, interesting lore or something is like a nice little bonus, if you like the lore in Hollow Knight, or if you enjoyed the story in Death's Gambit. That's probably not why you played those games in the first place, though. You came for the Metroidvania. And I don't think that that's going to be why people go to Nine Souls, but it will be something that jumps out at you. This story is really good. The world building is really good. Characters have deep, complex motivations for what they're doing and why they interact with each other in the way that they interact, and how real-world history has informed the game's history. how those belief systems connect and cycle from one to the other and back to the original. It's really, really, really good. I was surprised, but I shouldn't have been surprised. This is Red Candle. It's just a different presentation. It's not a capital H horror game like their previous games. So the story snuck up on me, but it is something that, like, I'm going to remember overcoming the challenges and mastering that final boss. But I'll continue to have great respect for the storytelling in Nine Souls, because I think that the difficulty is going to make some people bounce off of this or get maybe too frustrated to really internalize what's going on in the story. But I really recommend sticking with it. Do what you need to do. Customize the difficulty. There's a very customizable difficulty mode in Nine Souls. Do what it takes for you to experience the world, the beautiful artwork, the awesome music, the story, and everything else other than the combat that dominates the conversation around this game, the difficulty. This is a game worth experiencing. It's one of the best Metroidvanias I've ever played, straight up. And hey, don't take my word for it. Here's Dog Nozzle's list. Thank you, Dog Nozzle. And again, look forward to that future podcast with the two of us talking about Nine Souls. Dog Nozzle's number 3 is 1000 Times Resist. Number 2 is Nine Souls. And number 1, Pacific Drive, which I talked about in those honorable mentions. Next up on the list, number 2. People who might know me, who might know what I played, probably thinking, 2 games left that he hasn't mentioned. I know which 2 they're going to be, but what order are they going to be? Number 2, the best games in 2024 that I played is Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree. Shadow of the Erdtree is the DLC for Elden Ring, developed by From Software, published by Bandai Namco, and honestly, if you can trust me, you can trust me. If you're listening, you're very far into this podcast now. You know you can trust me. This is the 1B to the number 1's 1A, if that makes sense. There were 2 game experiences this year that absolutely blew me away and made that number 1 game of the year type of impact with me. And Shadow of the Erdtree was one of them. So here it is. You'll find out what the number 1 game is here in a second and why it gets the edge. But Shadow of the Erdtree. Now, I did an episode about this. It was a Patreon episode. You can listen to the entire episode on Patreon if you're a member. There's a public preview in the feed. The preview is like an hour long of a 2-hour episode, so it's a long preview. That's with special guest Charlie Young, who's a very smart guy. We had a great conversation about this. Now, Elden Ring was my game of the year in 2022 by a wide margin. Nothing came close to Elden Ring. And again, were it not for one of the most impactful games I've ever played in 2024, this DLC would have taken the prize again, because this is, in my opinion, this is better than the base game of Elden Ring. It is a better play experience than the base game of Elden Ring. To me, the secret sauce of From Software's games is not difficult boss fights. The bosses in this DLC are difficult, of course. It's not the secret sauce, though. And this DLC took things that makes From Software special. Because, like, let's be honest here. Honestly, as far as action games go, I don't think that From Software's action combat systems are the best. I don't think that. They are idiosyncratic, which is not bad, but they're different. You know, they're not the smoothest. The camera's not the best. The boss fight, you know, the design of them where the bosses are just insanely aggressive and stuff, I don't love that. This is not why I'm here. I'm not here for the best action game experience. I'm here for other stuff, and Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree improves that other stuff to a level that is just undeniable. The art design is ridiculous. This is some of the most beautiful video game levels that I've ever been through. The fields of the red and blue flowers, the stuff inside of Midra's mansion, the kind of ghostly graves out in the, the Gravesite plain when you first boot up the DLC, this dark looming shadow Erdtree, that's the name of the DLC. Oh no, I did it. The landscapes, the skyboxes, all of this stuff is beautiful. And From Software does it, better than so many other people, and it's more interesting in the DLC. From Software has always been masters of level design, and it feels like they took level design concepts, these looping paths and shortcuts and things like that. They did that because they always do that, but they extended it to the open world itself. Instead of having this flat open world to explore like in the original, we have a stacked vertical design that is the closest thing to the critically acclaimed world design of Dark Souls 1 that they've done since Dark Souls 1. It was endlessly entertaining for me to look out over a ledge, see something below me, know that that is something that I can go see, and then I got to figure out how to get there. And then like 15 hours later, I pop out from exploring a cave, I realize I'm in that spot, and I can look up to that spot where I was standing earlier, wondering how I was going to get there. This is the other game I had mentioned when I talked about studios who know what the fuck they're doing, refining their craft to like the pinnacle. This is From Software operating on all cylinders here. With the things that they do best, they're just flexing those things now. Also, if you're into the story of Elden Ring, this DLC gives some really fascinating context and backstory for some characters that we knew and why they did the things they did within the story, stuff like that. I really loved it. So I had an awesome 45 hours revisiting Elden Ring to play this DLC, exploring this new world, exploring these new dungeons, taking down more of these fucked up bosses, playing some multiplayer, helping people fight bosses as I like to do, just enjoying the things that I love about From Software's games felt like they were being prioritized in this DLC. And that is just, as the main character of the universe here, it feels good to be seen and have a game that feels like it was specifically made for me. After I finished the original game of Elden Ring, I was positive that there was no way the DLC could be better. But goddammit, it was. And hey, don't take my word for it. Listen to what these people have to say. Doug, a patron from Nostalgia Marcanum, gives the top 3 of Shadow of the Erdtree, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and Animal Well. And Lenka. Lenka's top 3 is number 3 is Persona 3 Reload, number 2 Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and number 1 Shadow of the Erdtree. So that was the number 2, and honestly, it's only number 2 because I didn't want to do 1A, 1B. I had to commit. Didn't take the coward's way out. I took the way of putting it at a number 2 and then taking a couple minutes to explain myself. But that's number 2. So what's number 1? What is the game that made more of an impact on me than everything else that I've talked about today? And honestly, if I were to stack up all the 63 games that I completed in 2024, this would still be number 1. So what is that game? The number 1 game that I played in 2024 is 1000 Times Resist. As I recorded that little thing before the music break here, I got a little lump in my throat and some tears came into my eyes because the experience of not only playing 1000 Times Resist, which, real quick, developed by Sunset Visitor, their debut game, published by Fellow Traveler, episode 123 of Tales from the Backlog with special guest Michael Hyam. As I brought up the game, all of the experiences this year of playing the game, of discussing it on my podcast, of discussing it on Pixel Project Radio's 2-part series, and of listening to everyone else's podcast, reading the the blogs, the think pieces, the reviews, the analysis from so many people around gaming, it brought tears to my eyes because this is the most impactful game that I played in 2024. It is an outstanding work of art. And that's why it got the nod over Shadow of the Erdtree. Not just because it's a brand new thing, not because I need to put a new product over a DLC, none of that bullshit. It's because this game has an emotional resonance to it that nothing else this year gave to me. I recorded that podcast with Michael Hyam back in May or June or something like that. So we weren't the first people to record podcasts or shout from the rooftops about this game, but we were pretty early on this. And since recording that, it has been a nonstop flow of new takes and new opinions as more and more people discover this game, more and more people play it, and more people have that same impact that we did. And so that's been awesome to see our friends around podcasting and gaming criticism. A lot of times like games like this will have this hype and you might have this instinctive pushback against it to think it can't be that good. It can't be that affecting. These people are just playing it up. And it's been awesome to see all of these people, not everyone has that, but some people boot it up with reservations or with a wall built up to just be like, it can't be that good. And then people are like, fuck, it is that good. And it's been awesome to just see this steady flow over the last 6 months or so of more and more people discovering it, more and more people enjoying it, and more people adding to the conversation. The astounding thing about 1000 Times Resist is that there is so much going on in the story. There are so many themes being covered. There are so many things being interwoven into this, it's not a mess. It's it's like, think of the ball of Christmas lights in Christmas Vacation that's like, forever tangled up like that. But what if they did that on purpose, right? Like, what if that was the most perfect work of art with all of these strands interwoven to each other, that it will take tons and tons of hours of conversation and writing to untangle it all, examine the individual threads, the individual themes, but also how those things work together to form this amazing product. That's the cool part. And I really love something that friend of the show, Flora Marigold, chose to focus on in her Epilogue Gaming article. She chose to not just add her one take into the conversation. She kind of like captured what this game's conversation is actually like, which is a bunch of other people's opinions. And thank you for shouting out this podcast, Flora, in that article, but other people's articles, other people's podcasts, and just kind of adding to all of these different conversations, because the game is so deep that 30 people can play 1000 Times Resist, and 30 people can want to have 30 different conversations about it. It is that dense, and the miracle is that with all of these themes and storylines coming together and influences and all of that, it doesn't leave any of them hanging out to dry. They all get attention, they all matter, and they all go into the final product. I haven't even talked about what the game is or what it's about. And at this point, I almost don't want to say it. If you're listening to this and wondering like what's this game about? It's a very gameplay light adventure game, we'll say, with incredible cinematic presentation, very good, understated, but very good voice acting, awesome writing, and an attention to detail in the process to make sure, again, that all of these parts, all of these themes, all of these storylines, all of these characters matter. So if you're interested in a sci-fi story, a very personal story that connects back to lots of things in our real world, like living through a pandemic, uprising and protest, revolutions, religion, and so much more, you owe it to yourself to try this game out. So my hat goes off to the team at Sunset Visitor again for their debut video game, taking their experiences and their influences from other types of media, other types of entertainment, other types of productions, and making it into a game unlike anything that we've ever played before. And I think that when you listen to a lot of Game of the Year podcasts, you watch your Game of the Year videos, you read your end of the year lists, I think that this is going to be one that all of us who played 1,000 Times Resist will basically be able to, like, you know, look across the room, make eye contact, and give that knowing nod to each other. That real ones know type of nod. And going forward, one of the cool parts about Game of the Year time is that it adds games to wish lists. It gets people to try those games out for the first time. It gets people to get curious about, hey, I've never heard of that. Why is it so high on these people's lists? And not just with 1,000 Times Resist, with other games like Nine Souls and Mouthwashing and Animal Well. And if you haven't played Balatro yet, god damn it, like, try it out. But it's really going to, I think, give this game the push that it deserves. Every push that this game gets, 1,000 Times Resist, is deserved. And I'm going to be really happy to continually live this experience of seeing the evolving conversation around this game as more and more people play it for the first time. So that is my number one game of 2024, 1,000 Times Resist. But hey, don't take my word for it. Here's what some other people have to say. Slugcat Stew, who's a patron, gives the top 3 of Shogun Showdown at number 3, 1,000 Times Resist at number 2, and Arco at number 1. Rick, who's a patron from Pixel Project Radio, gave the number 3 of Black Myth Wukong, number 2 Metaphor Refantasio, and number 1 1,000 Times Resist. And if you want to hear a 2-part podcast breakdown analysis of the story of 1,000 Times Resist, you can hear me do that on Pixel Project Radio. Next up is Rouge, who's a patron. Thank you, Rouge. Number 3 is Sheepy, a short adventure. Number 2, Slice and Dice. And number 1, 1,000 Times Resist. Next is Artful Scruff, who gave an unranked top 3 of Unicorn Overlord, Dragon's Dogma 2, and 1,000 Times Resist. And last but not least, we have Control-Alt-Noob, who gave an unranked top 3 of Astrobot, 1,000 Times Resist, and Animal Well. So that is the end of the list. To recap the top 10, number 10 was Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, number 9, Mouthwashing, number 8, Balatro, number 7, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, number 6, Metaphor Refantasio, number 5, Animal Well, number 4, UFO 50, number 3, Nine Souls, number 2, Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree, and number 1, 1,000 Times Resist. And a reminder that all 10 of these games either are already in the podcast feed or will be early in 2025. So please, if this is your first time listening, go check out those episodes, those discussions, find out in much more detail than I was able to do today why they made the list and why they were so special. Also, a reminder that if you're interested in hearing this podcast but covering the best non-2024 releases that I played for the first time in 2024, that episode is over on Patreon, patreon.com/RealDaveJackson. If you sign up on Patreon, you can hear that episode. You can also hear a bunch of other bonus episodes. You can vote in monthly polls for what games I do on the show. There's a bonus retro gaming series called Tales from the Way Backlog, and much more. So thank you all for listening. I'm really excited to look forward to what's coming in 2025. I know there's going to be some amazing games. What's awesome in particular is I know some of the games that I'm looking forward to in 2025, like Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii and Monster Hunter and a bunch of other stuff, Wander Stop. There's a lot to look forward to there, but the cool part, and this is the hidden part, this is what you should be excited about. The cool part is there's going to be a bunch of stuff coming out that I have no idea about. as I'm recording this right now. As I look at this top 10 that I made from this year, let's see, Mouthwashing, Balatro, Metaphor Refantasio, UFO 50, and 1000 Times Resist were all games that I either knew nothing about going into 2024 or knew very little about. And that's the coolest part about all this, is how we think we know what's coming up, and we know about some stuff, and we're excited about those, but some stuff that can seemingly come out of nowhere and just blow you away. And that's very exciting, and something I can't wait to see what comes up in 2025. So that will be all for this episode. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for the support throughout 2024. I can't wait to see what comes up in 2025. And as always, tune in next week for the next game to come out of the backlog. All right, thank you for listening to the Top 10 Games episode from 2024. And all that's left to do is say thank you to the people who help support the show over at patreon.com/RealDaveJackson. Big shout out to Chris Nelson, Zulgeek, Chris Copleen, Ryan Player One, JD, Eric Guess, the Top 3 Podcast Crew, Backlog Adam, Nikolai at Night, Jill, A Novel Console, Kieran, Charlie Young, Soccer, Cupcake, the Pre-Order Bonus Podcast, Matt aka Stormageddon, Randall, Bryant, Kyle, Christian S., Joe from New Dawn Games, Stephen Pay, Doug Leaf, Jason Emery, Rob Shack, Brian Skirsha, Jake Martin, Jenny E., Dave C., Esteban Goyante, Snack Taku, Gaming Memories, Low 5 Alex, Ryan McBride, Roos Launcher, Rick Firestone, The Retro Vixen, Slugcat Stew, Jared, Marcus O'Neill, Rouge, David Stecco, Steve, Silcanet, and Lenka. Thank you all for your support so much. Looking forward to 2025. I hope you are too. Take care.